I'm in the business of wanting to resurrect that triumphant beast in you.
Welcome to The Boundless Body, the podcast with a somatic doctor interviewing innovative thinkers about their perspectives relating to the arts and sciences of therapy. Discover The Boundless Body.
Back to the mystery.
Okay, so we have the honor of having Cindy Jones on The Boundless Body today. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Cindy is one of the creators of this wonderful technology called Bi-Tapp. And so we'll talk about Bi-Tapp and the clinical implications of these tappers. But before we do that, I'm just going to read out your bio. Cindy Jones is one of the owners and the CEO of Bi-Tapp. Cindy and her business partner, Haley Taylor, have created a patented wearable device that taps for you, regulating your nervous system in real time. The tappers are being used by all ages with profound results. Cindy is also a mental health therapist of over 28 years, specializing primarily in trauma resolution. She has worked with individuals, agencies, and the community at large after traumatic events and tragedies. She served as the Southern Utah Regional Coordinator for EMDR, which is an EMDR training institution, for several years, bringing trainings to Southern Utah and supporting therapists in their professional growth and development as EMDR therapists. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So can you just tell us a bit about the origin story of this wonderful technology?
Sure. Probably have to just go back just a little bit before it was created. As you read, I'm a trauma therapist. And when I was in graduate school, it would have been in the 1990s. And so EMDR therapy was super new. And our professors just said it won't last and just don't pay attention to it. It's kind of a fad. And so I didn't and was trained in other modalities. But then probably 15, 16 years into my practice, a lady that I was seeing just had complex PTSD. And all we were doing, honestly, was just managing symptoms. They weren't resolving with the level of knowledge that I had. I took her as far as I could. And so I just invited her to explore other modalities to see if she could get help beyond what I could do. And she came back and just said, you've got to look at EMDR therapy. And so I took a year studying it, and then I was trained in it. And so part of EMDR therapy does include bilateral stimulation. And pretty quickly after being trained in it, I realized that if someone came in, people do often get dysregulated. They either come in dysregulated, or while they're working on something, they go up too high or they drop too low. So you're not really reprocessing. And so what I found over and over, independent of the protocol, that people could actually get regulated and get back to more of a workable range. And so I would just do the tapping. And then there was older equipment for EMDR therapy, but it was more of a vibration. And so it wasn't tapping. It didn't feel like manual tapping. And so I actually did more of this because it just, on the sides of their knees, it just felt more soothing and comforting. And Haley Taylor, who also helped create the tappers, she was running the practice so that I had like 8 therapists working for me. And I had taught that clinically to all of them. If they come in dysregulated, this is going to work better than all the other coping skills to get them regulated. And then it was actually Haley, who's not a therapist, that just said, well, why don't we just make that available to everybody? Wouldn't people benefit in between sessions to be more regulated? And maybe people on a waiting list, shouldn't they have something? Or maybe kids, because she's a mom in class, wouldn't they test better if they were regulated? So it was actually Haley that had that idea. And then we just talked quite a bit and then worked with some engineers, and we were insistent that it needed to feel like tapping rather than the older equipment. And so because of that, we were able to get some patents on it, and we've found remarkable results with all ages in pretty much all populations.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So let's talk about bilateral stimulation. Why is it useful? Let's talk about why bilateral stimulation is useful to the brain and useful for regulating experience, because it's really the foundation of EMDR therapy, which involves these eye movements, but these tappers are involving tactile. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about
Well, if we go even before EMDR therapy, which I think it was in like 1987 is when she created that. So if you go before that, occupational therapists have actually used bilateral movements and exercises for decades. And so if someone is struggling, say, academically or maybe just developmentally, they're struggling, they're going to actually, if they went to an occupational therapist, they're going to do a lot of coordinated bilateral movement to strengthen the two hemispheres communication. So that precedes EMDR therapy. And we didn't know all of that until we create these tappers, but we have other disciplines using the tappers now, and they're bringing in their knowledge and their research, and it's quite fascinating. So as part of EMDR therapy, as the story goes, Francine Shapiro's just distressed and she's walking and her eyes move and she realizes that that calmed her down. And then she brings up what she's distressed about again. Her eyes moves back and forth. She calms down and then she goes on to create EMDR therapy. And then lots and lots of people have added all these different protocols. You know, like if I'm working with a community tragedy, I'm going to be doing a group protocol rather than an individual one if I'm working with a large group. And so the bilateral stimulation in the old days before fMRIs, I think they believed that there was something about it that might be activating trauma, but research now shows it's the opposite and it's inhibiting the amygdala, which is allowing people to then reprocess their trauma. And that's why I feel like it can, we've just seen it over and over. It's also a standalone resource. And if people say, how can that be? I would just say, how many times have you gone for a walk when you were upset or distressed and it calmed you down? Because that's coordinated bilateral movement.
Yeah. So when you mentioned occupational therapy, I thought about what's being called brain
Yes.
gym exercises,
Yes.
which often involve kind of like cross stimulation, bilateral stimulation
Yes.
to get the brain more integrated. Now, my research is a lot about the cerebellum,
Okay.
and it's been shown again and again and again in the research literature that the cerebellum has to be activated for effective trauma resolution therapy. There's only a couple of regions in the brain that need to be consistently lit up for the efficacy of processing trauma, and the cerebellum is a central one. So the cerebellum is going to be lit up back and forth during bilateral stimulation, and it certainly does during EMDR. I think personally that this is key in terms of integrating trauma memories and so on, because the cerebellum is what I call the master sequencer.
Mm,
So it sequences not only motor stuff like movement
right.
and sensory information, but now it's being shown again and again and again to sequence cognition, sequence emotion. And as we know in trauma, what happens is a person's experience gets really fragmented.
Right.
Read that, not sequenced.
Right.
Okay. If we stimulate the master sequencer, which my hypothesis is this is exactly what these Bi-Tappers are doing. And we would just need to get some research funding in
Sure.
order to prove that.
Sure.
But this is, I think, a really good hypothesis behind why it's working. But see, the thing is that you have tons of subjective information from people, first responders, educators, people in addiction recovery, and they
Right.
don't need the kind of complex EMDR protocols, right? All they need is the tactile stimulation,
Well,
right?
because what we found, yes, and because we do a lot of community work after a tragedy, and I believe as a therapist, I believe that less people reach out for help than do. And so to be able, like formal treatments, what I mean. So to be able to have something to regulate their nervous system, whether it's in the middle of the night, if they can't sleep or they had just had a nightmare at school or at work, they're just functioning better. And that is independent of therapy. We understand now it's used as a standalone resource and we are getting great results. And I love what you're saying about the cerebellum, and that makes sense the way you're describing it, why it's working. I mean, we came
Yeah.
at it through the door of it's working because it's inhibiting the amygdala. And there is research on that bilateral stimulation inhibits the amygdala, but you're coming at it through a different door or you're adding upon. And that what you just said makes sense to me.
Yeah. So, can you just bring in some narratives about forums and places where the tappers have been used successfully? Just maybe tell a story or two about
Sure.
a first responder or somebody in education or a parent or something like that that's just reported great results from this
Yeah.
bilateral stimulation
So,
process.
so first, just to say something just about the tappers is what we chose to do when we were creating them is we knew that people who had flight anxiety, so if you think about an international flight, it could be like 18 hours plus. And so we chose intentionally to have the best battery on the market so that we could have that, it's like 50, 60 hours plus before you have to recharge it. So we didn't want someone, whether they're in school or a firefighter, just to have it just like not work, because then that's not helpful to have to stop in the middle of what you're doing. And then the other benefit is you can customize the settings. And so say a 9-year-old using it versus me who's 55, I will probably like it slower than they do. And so that's the thing that's nice is people can adjust the settings to get exactly what they like how fast they like it and how strong they like it. That's a big deal because it'd be like if we all went for a jog, Brian, like we'd find our pace. And so everybody can actually dial in and customize very minutely, just really get what they like. And that's a big deal because if you only have a few settings, that's not going to help people. And so, just to give kind of a broad brushstroke, first responders are starting to use them when they go out on a call. So, just see you're heightened and you have stress hormones dumping, but they've also got to keep their prefrontal engaged, but it's stressful. And so they're trying to manage all of that. So some of them are wearing them during the calls, and then they're wearing them after as part of recovery. They're wearing them when they testify in court, when they write reports, and to help them sleep at night because sleep is really hard to come by for first responders. And most of them will not say they have post traumatic stress or even PTSD. They won't say maybe they struggle in their marriage. They won't say they struggle with addiction, but they will if I talk to them and say, do you want to sleep better? And do you want better relationships with your families? They can say yes to both of those. And then that's our in to try to help them. And so that's doing great work there. We were working with domestic violence agencies. And so how they're using those is what we found, and there's research that backs this up. If you tell your trauma narrative, there's a 70% activation going into sympathetic activation, and that if it's unprocessed trauma. And so they're able to hold the tappers or wear them like when they first, maybe it's a high crisis and they're being met in the ER. The caseworkers are being taught to hand them the tappers. And then, like you said, they can actually sequence better beginning, middle, and end and tell a fuller story. We have detectives with people who've been traumatized. They're being given permission, not with kids yet, but with adults to hand the tappers while they give a witness statement. And it's a much better witness statement. And then they don't have to keep going back and going back and going back. So that they're not being re-traumatized, having to bring it up over and over with the officers. And then obviously those ladies and children are using them at work or school to sleep. I can think of a community tragedy in our area a year ago. It was horrible. And we were able to raise money pretty quick through a nonprofit and able to hand out tappers to like the preschool, the elementary schools, middle school, high schools. And then the kids, they could see that we're using the tappers that were really struggling with high anxiety because of the trauma. They didn't make as many trips to the wellness room. They could stay in class. They could focus. So we've seen that. And then in a non-crisis situation, reading scores are going up, academic scores are going up, and attentional focus is better. So I definitely use the tappers for that myself. So if I'm working on something, I'll just throw them in my socks and I can focus better when I have the tappers on.
Throw them in the socks.
Throw them in the socks. Yeah. And then one
Yeah.
thing that's really interesting is we actually had a musician reach out to us and he uses it as a metronome. And he asked if the speed, if we could change it, like add the value on the top of the rate of speed of beats per minute. And so we have musicians using that and they can find the beats per minute that they want. And they will say they're learning their music faster when they have those on too. And they're obviously using it when they perform, but they say they're learning music faster.
Wow.
Yeah.
Some of my research has revealed that the cerebellum is deeply involved in musical processing.
Wow.
That clocks with that as well. In addition to the narrative sequencing piece that you just mentioned. So again, people get fragmented in their capacity to report
Right.
when they're traumatized, and they're
Mhm.
upregulated and bouncing off the walls, and perhaps dissociated.
That's
And the
right.
net result of that is a disjointed
Mhm.
narrative process.
Mhm.
And psychotherapy can be quite useful because it helps a person to turn to the left side of their brain
Right.
so that then they can get a little bit of distance. But if there's too much intensity, too much affect, too much emotion, then they're going to lose their capacity to put together the sentences and tell
That's
the
right.
story from beginning to middle to end. So, I mean, as a clinician, you've seen this all the time, right? Where
Mhm.
and I think everybody knows this. It doesn't have to be trauma. It could be that we're in the middle of an argument or something with a partner.
That's
As soon
right.
as intensity starts to ramp up, we start to kind of lose our ability to sequence and put together what we want to say.
Yes.
And the cerebellum is most definitely involved in putting narrative sequences together that are emotionally imbued, emotionally important, and all of that. Yeah.
Mhm. The other thing we found, I just thought of too, is just medically, they're finding we have occupational therapists that rehab people. So, like, just say you had a hand injury, and then now we've got to unwrap it, and now we've got to start to rehab it. So, they actually, the occupational therapists that are local, they've found the ones that kind of get stuck, like too nervous, and it actually, they're the ones that end up with complex regional pain syndrome. And so, what they found is if they put the tappers on them during rehab, during the appointment, that activation goes down and they won't report as high a pain because they say the pain center and the amygdala are pretty closely aligned. So if they can calm it down, then they're actually able to rehab better. And they're getting great results in terms of like right now, there's no cases in that department of complex regional pain syndrome. And that's a big deal.
That's a big deal. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. That's
Mhm.
cerebellar stuff.
Well, I'm talking to the right guy. That's great.
That's amazing. What about with autism spectrum disorders? Are people working with tappers in these conditions?
Yeah, in the schools, what they're reporting, and obviously parents are getting them too, and so it's not just limited to the schools, but what we're getting the most is that it's helping them with transitions. And so usually if they struggle like really rigid when things change, things like that, if they have the tappers on, they're able to do transitions better and their outbursts are not lasting as long. They're recovering faster. And so we do have some videos and stuff on the website about parents talking, and we have a high school student talking about that, and he could tell the difference when he had them on versus when he didn't, and his whole family could tell as well. So he just did much better.
There's a theory called the developmental diascasis model.
Okay.
And what that basically means is that the earlier that the cerebellum has been damaged, if it's been damaged either genetically or through a virus, or that the earlier that the cerebellum is damaged, okay, the more likely that the person is going to have developmental disorder.
Okay.
So this is why early intervention is key.
Sure.
I would want to have folks working with autism spectrum disorders, which are very cerebellar. In the literature, the connection is very clear to have people that are involved with early intervention strategies to use the tappers because it's going to support them in doing precisely what you said in this occupational therapy environment, which is going to help them to sequence on a motor level, but also on an emotional level so that they can move through transitions easier, that they can sequence social scenarios a little bit better.
Yep.
You know,
I
that
love
they
that.
can sequence their emotions a little bit better and put things into order a little bit more so
That
that
makes
they can,
total sense.
yeah. So
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's great. And there's enough early intervention programs that are, I think, looking and would be willing to try that for sure.
what about with addiction?
Well, what we found there is just to make it applicable to everybody, if you just think about like New Year's resolutions, like by what week do you revert back to your old patterns? And so our brain really does know what comforts it and what calms it, whether that's healthy or not. And so with addictions, what happens when they get triggered is if you were to talk to them, their immediate reaction is a relapse. Like they know what to take or what to do to bring that down. And so they do want to work their program, but if they stay heightened too long or they drop low, then those are their danger zones. And so what the tappers are doing, because if, in my experience is if someone goes up into, say, sympathetic activation, nobody's going like from optimal level down. And so if we can catch it on the up when they're first activated, wanting to, starting to ruminate a little bit about a relapse and get that down to that optimal workable range, then I believe then what we're seeing is they can work their program and then they'll say, yes, I need to go to my next meeting. I need to call my sponsor. I need to go for a walk, but they won't do that if they're too high up. They just won't. So, but none of us do anything healthy 0 to 10, 8, 9, 10. It just that, that prefrontal is just not working the same. And so the tappers are just bringing it into that window of tolerance or optimal level of a workable range. So then they can make better choices. And we're finding that with the first responders too, because they're going to stay up all night and game or do something because they don't want to go to bed. And so it's just being able to just get the systems back working together so that they can, be at their best because they're exhausted.
One of the things that I try to stress with my neuroscience students is when I define the term regulation, nervous system regulation, it's often kind of collapsed into just one side of a continuum. The side of the dampening of negative stuff, the dampening of the intensities that feel bad. And there can be a de-emphasis on the other side of the continuum, which is the amplification of positive states.
Right.
So I like to really stress this and say, because a lot of people, it's important, deeply important to have the dampening of negative affects that are very disorganizing and impair the brain and the cerebellum's capacity to sequence. But the other side of the equation is that these tappers and these methods have the power to really fill out this whole continuum. And that means it's not just about, dampening the negative, it's about amplifying the positive stuff,
Right.
So when I'm using the tappers clinically, I'm using them to help to imprint positive experiences, to get people to use the tappers when they're accessing a really positive memory, so that we can get those positive memory networks in the brain lit up, reconsolidated, and get those neurons to fire together and wire together. So it's not just about dampening negative stuff. It's about giving the body a capacity to really let it rip and have, I say, rock and roll and regulate instead of just regulate.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's a fuller expression of that. And I 100% agree with you. That's great.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about your experience using the tappers clinically on maybe both sides of the continuum, amplifying positive states and dampening negative states and helping people to regulate and calm down?
Sure.
Yeah.
If I just take it bigger first, I live in Southern Utah. And so here, we've had some tough stuff. So like in, say, 2017 was that Las Vegas mass shooting, and we had a lot of people from our community there. And so with that group, you do the group protocol, you do recent event trauma protocol, and they're still struggling on a pretty high level in between sessions. And so that was actually like the month after we came out with the tappers. And so I called some of those adults in individually. They were really struggling. And that was, I deal with individual high-end trauma, but this was the first time you're walking into a room and it's a lot of traumatized people and it's just a different level of fear as a therapist, like this better work. And, but anyway, do everything you know to do. And then they're still struggling quite a bit. And so that was the first group. I just called them in individually and I just said, you are adults and I want you to try this. And if it doesn't work, you just turn them off. If it does work, great. And just showed them how to each work tappers. And every single one of them came back, every single one of them, and said they could sleep better. They were able to work. They could recover from triggers. We had people, when they heard the country singer, the song that was being played when that happened, if they were in, say, Walmart and they heard that song, they were screaming for everyone to run out of Walmart. I mean, it was at a pretty high level for a while. And so these people were able to regain their daily functioning in a level they couldn't without the tappers. So I can see just right off the bat, we saw the power of bilateral stimulation when they were highly traumatized. So clinically, I do practice as an EMDR therapist. And so I do start with eye movement if possible, or if it's a visual trauma, I want them to moving their eyes. But some people, they want to close their eyes and they need to be able to work through that. And then that's where I switch always to tapping. And either I'm going to do the tapping on the side of their knees. In the old days, they would have said on the top of your hands, but that doesn't work either because someone might need to move or wipe tears and, stuff like that. So the side of their knees with permission, or they use the tappers, and the tappers feel like the tapping as if I were doing it. And so that's part of reprocessing. And then obviously to improve a positive state, I've seen over and over, and I think a lot of people have that the bilateral tapping just adds to that, just like you said, to increase the positive state that they're feeling. And so, and then I like how the tappers tap, because if they're on their own and say they didn't have tappers for just whatever, then they could actually just tap their feet back and forth, or they could tap on the top of their thighs and it feels the same. And that's what we wanted, is we wanted it to feel the same as if I was tapping them. We just wanted it to feel the same. And we were able to create that.
Brilliant. So as a somatic psychologist, my ears really pricked up when you were talking about closing the eyes so people can focus on somatic
Yes.
sensations.
It's important.
Because, the visual cortex takes up about 80% of the juice of the energy in the brain. So it can be really, really important for some people to get that somatic information,
Yes.
which there's a lot of it during these highly emotional, highly stressful events.
Mhm.
And, I've been training body workers, touch therapists for, over 15 years. And so I am a unique psychotherapist in that I use touch
Mhm.
as an intervention strategy. There's C-tactile fibers throughout the entire connective tissue system of the body. And when you touch the body very gently with no movement, and so it's not like a massage, it's worked directly with the nervous system without doing any stimulation, it's just stillness touch.
Mhm.
Those C-tactile fibers register in a way that the person can regulate. So I just put one hand on an autonomic plexus in the body, like on abdomen or something like that, so that I'm helping to soothe the nervous system during trauma processing. Okay. And the reason why I love the tappers is I can have one hand on my phone to turn them on and off.
Yeah.
I put the tappers on the people's ankles,
Yep.
and then I touch them, and then they can close their eyes and really go deeply into the trauma scene. And I just find it to be extraordinarily effective.
That's
Okay.
really
So
great.
I've had people, for example, clear a major trauma from a car accident in just one session.
Mm.
It's really, really efficient, really, really powerful work. And it's not just about processing trauma. It's about encouraging people to map out and consolidate memories that are good,
Yes.
so that they can close their eyes, they can get that touch support, and then they can really, really focus on the positive sensations that go with holding a positive memory in mind.
And for some people, that's scary, right? So it takes time to get there, even the positive.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. Well, in the trauma literature, it actually has been shown that third person consciousness is actually a safer place to start.
That makes
And
sense to me.
right. And so, because people dissociate during trauma, people dissociate, and that's like dissociation is seen as like a pathology or something, that needs to be immediately treated because it's bad, but it's really just an intelligent organismic response to a horrible situation.
Mhm. It's a survival.
Yeah. And one way of thinking about dissociation is it's hitting the ejection seat to get into a third person awareness, because it's not safe to be in the body.
Right.
And this is why I tell a lot of somatic students, listen, we can't just assume that being in the body or being in a memory or a positive memory is going to be a safe place to be.
That's right.
And so this is why it can be very, very useful to get the person to close their eyes and start from, and pretty much everybody can do this. It sounds complicated or it sounds like, only somebody with a highly developed imagination can do this, but it's actually really, really intuitive and easy for a person to then imagine looking at themselves from a distance. Okay, let's say that they're on a mountaintop and they see a vista and their body is tingling and they're feeling wonderful, but they're not ready to fully be in their body yet because they're going to get somatic intrusions. Where people that are traumatized, any body sensation, whether it's good or bad, can be read as an intrusion and
That's
send
right.
them into fragmentation and all that. So it's really, really useful to get that person to see themselves from the outside first. And again, the trauma literature absolutely supports this, that starting from the outside first before we go too quickly into being on the inside in the body and mapping those sensations is the safer way to go.
Yes, that makes sense to me. And
Yeah.
I would imagine, maybe newer therapists just jumping in too quick can inadvertently, probably some of us more seasoned therapists still do it sometimes, but just jump in too quick and then we have to back out. So slower is
Yeah.
faster for sure.
Slower is faster. Can't just jump into embodiment, right? Just assume that the body is going to be a permanent resource or something.
Right. Right. Well, I love how you're using the tappers though with your work, and it's just interesting, just clinically, just to see it, and then I would just say, have the courage to then say, let's make this available, and then now to see just all the different ways it's being used and how it's helping people. And Haley and I both just feel grateful.
That's so cool. Today is a momentous day because I just finished the last sentence of my 500-page book.
Congratulations. That's a big deal.
Visionary Somatics, which is what the book is called, will be teaching students protocols and methods to work with trauma creatively and to also use touch methodologies like what I just described, using the tappers, not just process traumatic experience, but to develop their imagination and their capacity as therapists. So I'm really excited to be collaborating with you, Cindy.
Yeah, that's exciting. I'm proud of you. That's a lot of hard work. I think a lot of people start, but maybe don't cross the finish line on that big of a project. So great job.
Yeah, thank you. So, and I just want to appreciate you for standing up to sponsor the Boundless Body podcast. Thank
We're
you so
happy
much
to.
for that.
You
Yeah,
bet.
yeah. Can you just tell the audience a little bit about, why back this pretty much brand new podcast? What did you see in me? What did you see in the podcast that was like, oh yeah, this is a good forum to support?
Sure. Well, I've listened to your podcast, and I just love how you're bringing in different disciplines. You're just bringing everyone together. And what I believe is that, all the different disciplines have truth, but I don't think any of us have all the truth. And so being able to bring all of us together, and I feel like that's what your podcast does by the different guests you bring on. And that's how we feel about the tapper. Like just because now we're collaborating with so many different disciplines, and we can just see the benefit of that interdisciplinary collaboration. And that's, I feel like, what you represent.
You nailed it. Interdisciplinary research and multimodality treatment. That's what Visionary Somatics is. That's what the Boundless Body is all about. I have been trained in EMDR and I honor the tradition very deeply.
Sure.
But it can also be upsetting when they say, don't get creative with the protocols. For an artist like me, I'm like, that's offensive.
Well, it's interesting because, I can see that from two ways. Like one,
I know, yeah.
where I used to be a clinical supervisor of many people, I didn't want them to be creative until they could tell me why they were being creative, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, exactly.
Like they have to have a reason why they're veering. But if you were to see I'd have to think in my office, there's probably 2 or 3 books of just all these different protocols, because the standard protocol cannot fit every situation. It just can't. But she had to start somewhere. Many people have found what you have found. And I think honor what you're doing because you're getting the results and you know what it is you're doing. Because even I remember one time, so I was in a car accident and I got hit on the right side. And so we did EMDR therapy on that because obviously I was a pretty jumpy driver after that. And then I'm like, oh, I'm going to go see what this brain spotting is. And they had me turn my head to the right after they activated the trauma scene. And then I didn't want to look anymore. So it just means there was just more in there where I would have thought it was cleared. So it just took it to a deeper level when I reprocessed turning to the right. So I think people are finding things like that all the time, just ways to build upon the foundation that she created. And then we're just building upon it and adding knowledge to it is what I believe. And I think if she were here and I could show her about the tappers, I think she wouldn't think I've gone rogue. I think she'd be like, that makes sense because it just does. And I think when she had those protocols, that protocol created initially, I mean, there was no fMRI machine. There was nothing. So it was just a lot of assumptions of what it was doing. But now we have fMRI machines and we have just so much more with neuroscience to be able to really see what's going on with the brain. And that's why I think, like you said, we've got to add other things that we already know work. And so like your work, how you're talking about the cerebellum, I mean, honestly, how much is that even talked about? On a, you're being a pioneer in a way and bringing this to the forefront. So I think we're at a really exciting time right now. Everything about the brain, like we just are understanding at a deeper level. And like even today, you've taught me quite a bit.
Yeah, I totally get it. Like the other side of the equation is in order to create an evidence base, you need to create a structure that can be replicated.
Right.
And if you don't create a structure that can be replicated, then you can't speak the language of an evidence-based practice. And EMDR is wonderful in that way now because, and you kind of need the protocols in order to do that, to meet the criteria for replication standards. So there's that. And then also I was thinking about like, if you want to learn how to dance, you know what I mean? You got to learn the basic structures
the fundamentals.
first. You got to learn the fundamentals before you can like really be in the creative dance. It's like you need structure first and then improvisation. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, and you're also seasoned. I mean, so you're able to take the good from that and then build upon it and add to it. And I think that's what makes you a good clinician.
Thank you. So how do folks get these tappers? And so how do folks purchase them? How do they use them?
Sure.
I don't know.
If you just go to the website, so it's bi-tapp.com. There's different pages where you can see how they're being used by a lot of people. The thing that's nice about it is you can literally use one set of tapper hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of times. And so we did get approval recently for health savings accounts and flex spending accounts. It's approved. So if you have one of those cards, it's actually approved. And in Utah, we've laid the foundation. Hopefully we can replicate this throughout the country, but we were able to get the Utah Victims of Crime program here. So if someone is a victim of crime, then the tappers are approved. And that's a big deal. So therapy is paid for. Probably in every state probably has a similar program, but so are the tappers now. And that was based off of what happened with Vegas. They were able to approve those for anyone that wanted them. And so that's a big deal. So we're just trying over and over to find different funding resources. We know some people can afford them. They're $307, and you should be able to seriously use them hundreds, if not thousands of times, like I said. So it's a very effective resource. What I love is if you have little kids, if the schools don't have tappers already, a lot of schools have tappers and they let the students check them out. But if not, then let's say you have a little elementary student that, maybe just gets anxious or has trouble focusing, gets in trouble a lot. You could actually set the settings at home and then they could put them in their socks or pockets, however they want to wear them. And then they can actually just click a button on one of the tappers and then the tappers remember the setting and they can use that all day long without their phone. And then when they go home, they can set it by the phone and it just reconfigures and then they can adjust the settings or maybe one of their siblings needs to use it. But that's a cool feature too. And so you can find a lot on the website and our contact information is on there. We're happy to answer questions. Pre-COVID, we partnered with, there was a teletherapy platform that wanted to have the tappers synchronized with, if you want to do eye movement or just have the therapist control the tappers, and it's through remote EMDR. And so that's a nice thing for teletherapists too. So everything's that was done pre-COVID. So we're grateful we did that before that all happened. And so all of that's in place for teletherapy. And that's been a good thing too.
Brilliant. That's so cool
Yeah.
about the learning consolidation stuff. I read this article about how people that smell like an essential oil, like chamomile or something like that, while they're studying,
Yes.
and then put the same essential oil on while they're sleeping, it helps with memory consolidation. So there's this, the contextual learning is actually really important. So like this description of like having the tappers on at a certain pace during school and then the at home at the same pace, I can see how that can support learning because you have this, brain-based contextual learning support.
Yeah, that's really good. And just us talking about that, it's really interesting. We have worked with college students, high school students too, but college, and then even like adults just trying to maybe progress in their career, but they have to pass tests. Like, so say you're a firefighter, then you've got to pass certain tests, and they do great until they test. And then that test anxiety just gets the best of them. And so we have a lot of great stories of people studying with the tappers and then using the tappers during the test and being able to pass those tests. And it's a big deal when you have a bunch of student loans and you cannot pass the test to then practice. And so they're able to use them to study and to also take the test and then pass because they know it. They just, it's just stage fright. They're just freezing. And it doesn't matter how much they study if that anxiety just kicks in. So it's really helping in that way too.
Yeah, I could see myself using these, speaking at a conference, right? Putting them in my socks.
Mine have been on the whole time. Yeah,
Nice.
I do.
It
helps me stay focused better. It's for me, it's mostly focus because if I go off on a tangent, good luck getting me to come back. So
That's cool.
Yeah, a lot of people are using them that way.
Yeah. And I did also want to mention that they're really efficient economically in the sense of, well, hey, sometimes, us therapists, of course, we can become a bit dependent on people coming back to therapy again and again and
Sure.
again. But, I think it's ethical and important and efficient to say, hey, listen, you can use these tappers outside of therapy so that you're
Absolutely.
not dependent on therapy to regulate yourself. Sometimes you just don't need therapy as much, and people can use these tappers without necessarily having to have therapy. I'm not saying that it's one size fits all or something
True.
like that, but
True.
it's like, how cool is it that people can take this resource out of therapy, put on the tappers when they're going for a walk or when they're learning or, when an intense experience is happening in the family or
Perfect.
when they're in conflict or whatever. And you don't have to like call your therapist and pay him $250 or whatever it is.
Yeah, see, that calls the cost of the tappers. And then you have them for however long. So no, it is true. And it gives people, if you just think even like someone that maybe has social anxiety, it just gives them more confidence. Like they want to connect and they want to, but it just, their anxiety can just get in the way. So if this can take the edge off, or if you're thinking about like with chronic pain, I'm not saying someone's going to go from a pain level of a 10 to a 0 and, sing kumbaya, but I am going to say that it takes that edge off. So then they actually can just function better. And that's literally what it's doing. I almost feel like if you're driving a car, it's like a gear gets stuck in the old days manual, shifting. This just helps it just move where it needs to move. And so you're back in you just are able to be your best self is how I would say it. And the one thing I forgot to tell you, Brian, is we have people who have had strokes and they are using the tappers and they are finding their words better when they have the tappers on.
Guess what structure in the brain is often affected in strokes?
Really? Must be the cerebellum.
Great guess.
Thank you. That's fascinating. That's really cool.
To resequence, because you lose because it's almost like a learning library of sequences. There's going to be some loss of that, and the sequence library needs to be rebuilt.
Well, I'm excited to read your book. Sounds like I need to read that book.
I'm excited too, Cindy. So thank you so much for being willing to sponsor this podcast.
Sure.
It's very, very appreciated, and I look forward to collaborating more with you in the future.
Thank you. I do too.
Thank you for listening to the The Boundless Body with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm, we're a colony, we're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.